So the topic for today's webinar is conflict and human displacement. And I'm happy to welcome Filippo Ferrero, Director of CIMA Center for Migration Studies in Cape Town, South Africa, to start this webinar with us. Please, Filippo Ferrero, welcome.
Thank you, Kaya, and good afternoon to everyone. A warm greeting from Cape Town. As you know very well, is the south of Africa. But as in our study center, we do research, publication, training related to migration and human mobility all around Africa, all around the continent. And this is obviously one of the topics that are most interesting. So thank you for the invitation. I will just give a quick overview, and I will try to do something that usually Study Center do in abundance, but I will be much more quiet. That is giving number and figures and trends and a lot of information. I think that talking about human mobility in Africa, obviously, if we start from the perspective of the subject of migration, we usually divide in three categories, that is forced migration, economic migrants, and the victims of human trafficking and all those gray area of exploitation that go around. Obviously, when we talk about victims of conflicts, they enter into the first category. But honestly, we must also say that sometimes there are strange things happening because we can find victims of conflicts that search another way or other routes to find a safe harbor from what they are fleeing from. And at the same time, there are other people that take advantage of the situation of a migrant who is fleeing from a conflict to have the same benefits. I say this because when we try to capture figures, this is not so easy. And for many reasons. The first is obviously that migration is not easy to monitor, it's not easy to collect data. We rely on the collection of the big international organization from IOM to UNHCR and other organizations. Other study centers, universities, as we do, try to do their own investigation. I see that many times it's more qualitative investigation than quantitative, and it's very difficult to have real figures about this. So the second thing I would like to say is that when I'm asked to talk about migration in Africa, I always to start from a basic thing that you probably know very well if you are already into the subject. That is that the fact that migration in Africa is, first of all, a regional movement. Means that migrants move for any of these reasons, no matter if it's about forced migration or economic migration of human trafficking, they move in their own region. And I mean with region, those macro areas, as can be Western Africa, Central Africa, Southern Africa. But there is obviously a percentage of them that is around 20, let's say 25%, that is oriented to international migration. Obviously, we are talking about also many of those who try to come to Europe. This is one of the way, as well as we have a channel that leads to Northern America, US and Canada, and a channel that is related to the Arabic states. When we talk about conflicts, obviously, we mean a situation that unfortunately is very familiar in the African context and is causing a big movement of people. The first thing is also that before having a big impact on those who apply for asylum seeker or refugee status because of their fleeing from a conflict, the first picture is the one of the displaced people, because that's the first and also very visible result of conflicts in Africa. But obviously, since this is the definition, it's internal displaced people and person that so don't cross the border and don't embrace an international route or journey. They are not exactly the real topic of our conversation today. I would like to just go through some of the main conflicts that are in Africa and are still generating a big movement. When we talk about Western Sahel, the data we have are about 2023, that is quite updated. We've got obviously a big number of refugees, asylum seekers, and IDPs. I mention especially three areas that are Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Burkina Faso and Niger have been, I think, also not so much in Europe and US, but at least in other places they are on the news about the coup d'état that has been that took place in those countries, and obviously the influence also of other countries like Russia, Turkey. And we see that the figures talks about Burkina Faso, 55,000 refugees, 90,000 asylum seekers, and 2 million IDPs. What about Mali? We got 25,000 refugees, 14,000 asylum seekers, and 355,000 IDPs. While in Niger, the numbers are more or less the same of Mali. Another area that we know is producing a great movement is Sudan and South Sudan. Even if we know that South Sudan is only partially contributing to the international migration because of conflicts, because the main movement of South Sudanese refugees is regional and is going to Uganda. I say this also because we work there as an organization, and we are right now busy with data collection for a big research on the key performance indicator of integration of refugees fleeing from conflicts in local communities. But we know that this is affecting, obviously, the situation in Chad, and from Chad of Nigeria and Cameroon. So it's quite complicated because obviously conflicts in these areas are producing a kind of domino effect that is pushing a lot of migrants to search for asylum in other countries, and then to search their fortune in international journeys. Obviously, we're talking about all those people who come to the main spots on the Mediterranean Sea, that is Morocco and Canary Islands, the space of Tunisia, and the space of Libya. We got big numbers we were saying, but I know that also some other speaker will talk more about the figures. I would like to spend some more words about the roots of migration. So we know that there are different routes, and this is obviously linked to the fact that there is an already well-established migratory industry that offers some pattern and some routes, and then obviously these migrants who are fleeing from conflicts find easily a way and go on the same way with others who have a different cause. I mean, a different reason for migrating, that are, as we were saying, more economical migration linked to a family or clan network, or linked to search for better opportunities, or search for jobs that are related to their high school education. But this is showing us two different pictures, obviously, because those who flee from conflicts at the beginning is a part of is a group that is more mixed, while the economical migrants is already a more selected group of migrants, because obviously they need skills, and they need obviously resources, and they need the support, that is the support of family, the support of network, to engage this journey that is expensive and is obviously require a lot of capacity in managing different situations. When we talk about conflicts in Africa, obviously, we know that this is linked to situations that are always, how can I say, are linked to the instability of some areas and some regional areas, as the African Union call, they are the regional economic areas of Africa. And unfortunately, these is making the migration caused by conflicts a bit unpredictable when the new conflict or the coup d'etat erupts. But at the same time, we have some possibility to I don't say predict, but to see where the main routes will increase. This is obviously important for us because these numbers of migrants who go to the coasts of the Mediterranean have obviously the same expectation, that is being able to enter European soil, but obviously they make different routes, and they have different situation. Currently, obviously, I'm based on the data that we have and the information. There's a situation that is increasing, obviously, on the routes to the what we call the Western African European route, so that Morocco, and obviously this means that the route is aims at reaching the coast of Spain. Obviously, we got the situation in Melilla and in Ceuta and in Spain, and then the Canary Islands that have been reached by many migrants in the last year. While the situation is a bit more difficult to understand, both in Tunisia and in Libya. In Tunisia, because there's the influence, obviously, of government, the local government and other European government, who are trying to govern the situation. While in Libya, that has been for many years the main hotspot of migrants who want to reach the coast of Italy. The situation is not, I mean, is not monitored. That's the main thing. the data we have are very few and they're not so clear. Obviously, in what I was just very roughly portraying, I didn't include was the movement of Egypt and Syria that obviously prefer the Balkanic route, and then they go obviously on the other side. This is mainly the picture of how conflicts are pushing migrants. But I think that these two things must be really taken in consideration. That anyway, the journey of those who are fleeing from conflicts is mixed with other, and this mixed migration is a clear pattern of African migration. Because they use the same route, because some of the smugglers or those who facilitate migration serve both kind of migrants, that is also economical or other victims of human trafficking or smuggling, and also the fact that sometimes those who flee from conflicts, they try to find also other routes. But the big issue is that obviously once they arrive to the coast, the movement for who is undocumented is very limited, and their vulnerability is very high. In this portrait I try to share, I didn't mention about, even if it's what I work every day with, the route that goes to the south, because it's anyway a big part. And then I'm talking about especially DRC and Somalia and Ethiopia, thinking about obviously Kivu conflicts and Tigray, or the situation in Somalia that is is a kind of permanent conflict, that are sending big numbers of asylum seeker and refugees to Southern Africa, passing through especially Malawi, Zimbabwe, Mozambique to South Africa. I will stop here for now, and obviously I'm open to any kind of further question. And I didn't want to obviously give exhaustive presentation, but just few things to just to set up the scenario for the conversation.
Thank you very much, Filippo Ferraro. I think you have given an interesting overview and overview over situations and conflicts in Africa and how this affects local and global migration. Gives us a good place to start. I'm happy now to give the word to Hans Morten Haugen. Hans Morten Haugen is professor at the Faculty of Theology and Social Sciences at VID Specialized University in Oslo. And I'm very happy to welcome Hans Morten, and I hope he can lend us some interesting perspectives into this conversation. So welcome, Hans Morten.
Thank you. I am going to speak about the issue of Norway, primarily being a host of the refugees. And I am going to start with showing what is in Norway what is called now multicultural Christian network. This is in Norwegian. I couldn't find any text in English, but it started as what is called Norwegian Ecumenical Forum on Immigration Issues back in 1989. And I was a member of this NÖFI from 1992 till 2002. both when I was working for the student Christian movement. I was actually a volunteer doing work for the student Christian movement in Norway. And when I started to work in Church of Norway, which is the Lutheran majority church in Norway from 1996 until 2002. This network is interesting because it kind of organizes all the Norwegian churches, and it is quite ambitious, I would say, as regards their priorities. Because if you go to the thematic field of work, they have this text also in Norwegian, but they kind of say that they are working for a common church involvement in migration policy, to mobilize a Christian or church actually voice for a more humane asylum and refugee policy, and be a promoter for enhanced rule of law, including for people who convert, for church asylum, which has actually been abandoned in Norway, and also for the stay of religious leaders in Norway. If you go further down, I want to show you the Facebook page. Do you have to share? Do you see now the Facebook page? Yeah. I just want to highlight the symbols that are in this Facebook page, because I think that is quite interesting. First of all, you have this page, this picture of the Holy Family, Joseph, Mary, and Jesus in Egypt, being refugees, which is a very strong, I would say, symbol. You have this figure here, 100 million people forced to flee, which is kind of really going into the global dimensions of this. And they did have a comment back when the budget was made, and this is links to the government of Norway on the 7th of October, when the state budget for 2025 was announced. A press release said that the government proposes to reduce the number of UNHCR acknowledged refugees, so-called quota refugees, from 1,000 down to 200. Some years ago, that figure was 3,500. And you see also other symbols and other kind of appeals that are given here towards a more inclusive society. I show this because I think it is quite important to kind of acknowledge that this is a cross-church network, which has, you can call it more conservative churches. Also, you have the Catholic Church, you have smaller free churches, and you have some churches who are representing the Kefal churches, the kind of Orthodox churches. So it's a quite broad network, and this is just the Facebook page. But I just wanted to show you this because of the appeal that is kind of, I would say, broad across the church denominations in Norway. So just to explain what VID Specialized University is, the VID stands for Scientific, International, and Diaconal. And being a specialized university in Norway means that you have kind of competence similar to university, but on a more narrow range of disciplines. So it is a place where I've been working also in the previous institution since 2006. And now I've been a professor in international diaconia for 9 years. I'm trying to kind of present the situation in Norway and the Scandinavian countries more in detail, but I just want to give you this overview of how non-profit actors, that could be diaconal actors, it could also be other actors like Save the Children or Red Cross, for instance, how they relate to the authorities and how they eventually supplement but also challenge the authorities. So like I try to kind of identify these 4 roles: being a pioneer, one was kind of response to societal needs but does not challenge the authorities, unlike a situation where you try to be a rights defender. And when it comes to the service content, you can be a service deliverer and it can be a welfare improver. That is a kind of modification of Kramer's model back from the early 1990s. I want to recommend, and all of these authors can be invited to this seminar later. These are books in Norwegian, but I want to show them as an example of, I would say, leading authors. None of them are scientists, if you can use that term, but they are activists, and they are very good communicators. I was last 2 days ago on Saturday, I was at the Norwegian Scholarly Literature Festival, and I heard a conversation between Rune Berglund Steen and Christina Quintano. She is half Maltese herself. And the title in English of Rune Berglund Steen's book that you find on the left is Between Barbed Wire and Open Seas. And he kind of writes about how the helpers are treated in various countries of the world. Quintano's 2 books, The Messenger from Hell, and the other title is Smuggler, or I would call it maybe Accompanier Across the Borders. Grenselos, I think the best is to call the person accompanier across the borders, being persons who are unselfishly, I would say, assisting refugees across borders. And the term smuggler, of course, is a person that does this for some kind of profit. The Moria book from Guro Kulseth Markerås and Katrin Glatz Brubach is also quite interesting. This book has been shared with all the Norwegian parliamentarians. And finally, a book by Heslein Lossius and Valle, Hope is What You Do. One of the stories are primarily from Palestine, another story is from the Greek refugee camps. All of these books, I would say, are quite well recognized in Norway in various ways. And I show this to kind of show that these are all of them I can recommend to be invited for later sessions in this seminar series. I wrote a PhD, or actually Dr. Philos dissertation that was defended by the University of Oslo, Department of Political Science, back in 2022. And it consists of these 5 articles, 3 being from Norway, 1 being Danish, and 1 being Swedish. The English-speaking articles kind of speak for themselves. I do find that the Christian leaders from various backgrounds in Norway, including diaconal leaders, various free church leaders, and deans and bishops in Church of Norway, as well as mission leaders, are quite non-nationalistic in their approach. And also, I would say that the same applies to the youth in the youth groups. These are not necessarily very actively Christian youth, but they are participating. 5 of 6 of my focus group interviews were done with youth clubs, and 1 out of 6 was done in a youth post-confirmation training course. 45 youth in total. And I titled my article, Faith Among Youth in Church of Norway Means Greater Interreligious Acceptance, meaning that the most open-minded persons, when it comes to people having other faiths than Christianity, were those who themselves were relatively clear in their own Christian convictions. Then I have an article that speaks about the Church of Norway's leaders and also Norwegian Church, 8 at that time leaders, warning publicly against voting for the Progress Party, which is a populist party on the right in Norway, and how that can be justified. I went to Sweden. I identified how the Sweden Democrats, that now has close to 20% in opinion polls, at least more than 15, has tried to appeal to Christianity, and how that was received, particularly by Church of Sweden, but also other actors in Sweden. And the reception was relatively cold, I can say. And then the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Denmark and the multicultural challenges. This was based on the decade when Fogh Rasmussen was Prime Minister of Denmark, with a liberal conservative government that was supported by the Danish People's Party from 2001 onwards. And they instituted quite several measures to restrict the immigration pattern and the amount of people coming to Denmark in that decade. And then I've been writing other articles since then, and I don't want to quote them, but what is common, and I try to find explanations for why Church of Norway really stands out as being relatively open-minded towards refugees, not being in a way appealing to some kind of what you call conservative national religious values. And I tried to kind of say that the explanation as I find it, this is not based on detailed questions, but it's based on how the respondents respond in my different data collection, is that you have, first of all, this heritage of Church of Norway primarily being a tool for forced assimilation of indigenous people in Norway, the Samis, as well as national minorities in Norway, particularly the Romani people, who are also termed the travelers. That the experiences from that kind of more than century-long forced assimilation has made Church of Norway priests and leaders very cautious in trying to impose, so to say, a Christian majority nationalistic, expansionist worldview in their overall messaging. And also the Norwegian mission movement. Norway was at least the country in the world that sent the most missionaries in comparison to the number of people living in Norway. And many of them were conservatives. And you can say a lot about missionaries, but in general, I would say that the missionary era, which is continuing, but on a less, I would say, intense level, has made Norwegian conservative Christian internationalists. I think that is also important to acknowledge that the mission's inputs have made people more globally oriented. And the third factor that I have found is that the receptivity of the impulses from the global south in the churches, not only liberation theology, but justice theology overall, has had quite strong influence in Norway. That would also apply to Sweden to a certain extent, and maybe to Finland, and to a lesser extent, I would say, to Denmark, which has been more national conservative in orientation, even if there are several exceptions to that. But I try to kind of explain it because to some extent I find it quite surprising that the tendencies are strong, and even when the leaders are asked, they are kind of maybe more immigration liberal as compared to the deans and the priests. Talking about Norway and the receptivity of those coming to Norway, what is important to say is that Norway has a voluntary system of settling refugees in Norway after they have been given permission to stay. Then they are moved from the reception centers and into the municipalities and the city districts. And if you go to the figures from 2023, which I did almost a year ago, there was much more compatibility between the requests made by IMDi, the directorate that seeks to resettle the immigrants, the refugees, and the number of decisions made by the different municipalities in Norway. The biggest deviation in 2023 was coming from the county of Vestland around Bergen, where there was just less than 10% deviation from the number of requests and the number of decisions of how many people to settle. You see the figures there. In 2024, on the other hand, there was much less, you can say, positive figures. There were deviations which were for 4 counties between 30 and 40%. That was in Agder in the south, Buskerud just west of Oslo, and Finnmark and Troms in the very far north. And only Oslo had a similar number of decisions made in the city districts in Oslo as compared to the number of requests made by IMDi. But you have to be aware of the fact that coming to Finnmark and Troms, they are asked by IMDi to resettle many more refugees as compared to the number of people living in Finnmark and Troms. Unlike, for instance, 3 counties just outside of Oslo, Vestfold, Telemark, and Østfold, east and south of Oslo, west and south of Oslo, where the number of people who are asked to be resettled is quite low compared to the number of people living in these counties. So this is a picture about the public resettlement done by the municipalities based on a given number of kroner for each of the persons that they accept to resettle in Norway. About Church of Norway, and currently I think 62% of the people in Norway are members. And I want to highlight one quote from the then presiding bishop. We do not have an archbishop in Norway, but we have a presiding bishop. And in 2008, that was Olav Skjevesland, the bishop of Agder and Telemark. And this was a protest against restrictions done by the then Labour/Centre/Socialist left government. And the quote says like this: "The government's measures towards asylum seekers are not in line with being a Christian cultural nation. Children and young people in particular are affected in an unacceptable way. It is stealing dreams and hopes from their future." This is my translation, but I highlight this most important part of the quote, which is this Christian culture nation. The Norwegian term is knapt en kristen, not kulturnasjon verdig. And I want to kind of highlight this term because a Christian culture nation can be used for the opposite purpose of arguing for hospitality. It can be used for kind of arguing for higher fences, because you want to protect the Christian culture and you want to protect it by raising the bars for coming to Norway in this case. But this presiding bishop, he kind of used the Christian cultural nation image to argue for being hospitable. And this was done not against a rightist government, but against the kind of leftist government in Norway. So it's not correct that Church of Norway is kind of harsher with regard to the Progress Party if they are in government as compared to other parties. They are, I would say, quite principled. And then I want also to highlight the introduction to a booklet from the Church of Norway Council on Ecumenical and International Relations, saying that the years after 2015 have exposed the inability of European politicians to take responsibility and show leadership. The situation in Europe, which is in many ways culminated in 2015, could have been handled with political will and cooperation. What was a political crisis in Europe has been given the name refugee crisis in the media and by politicians. So this is, in a way, how Church of Norway tries to influence the public conversation, I would say, about immigration issues. And then one can, of course, ask how successful they are. I'll come back to that later. This is one of the largest diaconal organizations in Norway, the Church City Mission. They can trace their history back to the 1850s, so more than 170 years. They have various services. One of them is a treasury place for picking up equipment for outdoors and other kinds of activities. And this was done in the summer of 2022, so they kind of had a strong appeal for the Ukrainians, but they apply generally for all kind of refugees. And this was a communication that is still, it is not physically there in this term anymore, but the Skattekammer, these 25 places are in operation still. In 2009, it established with the Red Cross Norway a center for what is called undocumented migrants. I'm using the term undocumented migrants, which is a term that refers to people who have not anymore, at least, legal permissions to stay. And by this, they are not given the rights to basic health and social services in Norway. The authorities know who they are. They're not clandestine. They're not kind of coming into Norway clandestinely, but they have not been returned to their home countries, and their permission to stay has expired. It also established a center in Bergen in 2013, and they also have operated in different cities shelter for homeless. This is done by the Red Cross, and the Salvation Army has situation demands based on various temperature limits, this service on offer. And in December 2023, I looked into my diary and I found that it's 4th, 5th, and 6th of December 2023, there was minus 15 degrees in Oslo, and the temperature sank to minus 25 a month later. And the quote is saying that Oslo violates human rights when people have to sleep outdoors. That was the message back in 2023. I don't have time to go through all these figures, but I want to just show you that the Norwegian population overall has been much more positive to refugees. I would say immigrants, because the questions relate to immigrants. In 2023 compared to 2002. I give you the figures only for those who are fully agreeing with the various statements. And this was launched in 2023. I would say that these figures are quite interesting. It is not so that people in Norway are generally becoming more skeptical. On a 20 years term, they are becoming much more positive to immigrants. And the immigrants, of course, can include people from the EEC area, from the European Economic Area. It doesn't only refer to those coming from outside of Europe. But another figure that came in April 2024, but had data from late 2023, shows a somewhat less positive image, you can call it. And the question, do you think immigration is mainly good or bad for Norway? And those saying that it's also very good or quite good was dropping from March 2022, when it was 53%, and down to 43% in November, December 2023, which is more or less the same level as in 2017. And also when it comes to the relationships between immigrants and the rest of the population, you can see that there is also quite more negative pictures in 2023 as compared to earlier years. I'm soon going to end, but I just want to show you this figure for Church of Norway, which are done in a quite broad survey comprising approximately 3,500 Church of Norway members, so that they have more persons that are asking to participate, but they kind of exclude those who are members. They exclude those who are not members in Church of Norway and include only those who are members in Church of Norway. And among those who are members, people can have a very active relationship to Church of Norway, being that they are church active and they are confessing some form of Christian faith. They are called green, while the red category is labeling, so to say, persons who are not having what they term a Christian faith themselves and who are very irregularly going to church. And among these two groups, kind of on the different side of a spectra, what is quite clear, and that consists over the years, is that you have a quite strong, not overwhelming, but quite strong, I would say, positive attitudes among the so-called green ones, that only 26% think that Norway must accept fewer refugees, while those who are red are saying that for 35%. And in 2023, the same question was asked, and it's more or less the same figures. And also regarding which region of Norway is most positive, that is also consistent. The diocese of Bjørgvin on the west has been the most positive, while the diocese of Tunsberg, south and west of Oslo, has been more skeptical towards immigrants. That was my presentation, and I'm looking forward to Daniela's presentation, which is going to be more about the borders made in various parts of the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Hans Morten. Thank you for the perspectives from the Norwegian context and the Norwegian church context as receivers of displaced people. That adds to the overall discussion, very much so. And so now it's my joy to give the word to Daniela Rapisarda. She's associate professor in theology and director of the PhD program in theology and religion at VID Specialized University in Stavanger, so not exactly the same as Hans Morten. And I am thinking that Daniela will give us some perspectives, theological perspectives from borderlands. So I'm very, very happy to welcome you, Daniela. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gaia. Yes, I will start with a figure from the Missing Migrant Project. As you might know, it's under the International Organization for Migration. They have collected data on deaths and disappearances of migrant people since the year 2014, and I will come back to why 2014. Another from the project revealed that the year 2023, last year, was the deadliest on record, with over 8,500 people dead on migration routes worldwide. And this death toll has increased by 20% from 2022 to 2023. Before 2023, the deadliest year was 2016, with a slightly lower total of 8,084 deaths and disappearances. So if you want to kind of follow a kind of curve, we can say we had this very high number, 2016, then the curve went down around 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Then the total was about 4,300 people are missing, and then it went up again in the following years with this peak of 2023. The Mediterranean Sea is the deadliest route for migrants. IOM estimates that around 75% of all border-related deaths worldwide happen in the Mediterranean. As you know, and Filippo has already been touching upon it, there are several routes that are followed to cross the Mediterranean Sea, and this includes the Atlantic from the west coast of Africa to the Canary Islands, the eastern, the western route, yet the most trafficked and deadliest is the central Mediterranean route going from northern Africa, particularly Libya, Tunisia, to Italy and Malta. And the reasons for the central Mediterranean routes being so dangerous are the length of the overseas journey, the increasingly dangerous smuggling patterns, gaps in search and rescue initiatives, restrictions on the life-saving work of NGOs, as well as the effects of agreements, for example, between the Italian government and North African countries. I am trying to follow now the outcome of this recent agreement between Italy and Albania, where two centers of so-called hospitality and detention, please note the combination of words, hospitality and detention, have been built. Migration policies have a direct impact on the number of border-related deaths. So, as mentioned, the Missing Migrant Project was started in 2014. And why 2014? Because it was prompted by two terrible shipwrecks that happened outside the Sicilian island of Lampedusa in October 2013. You might have heard about this. On the 3rd of October 2013, a boat traveling from Libya to Italy sank just half a mile from the coast of Lampedusa. And of the more than 500 passengers, mainly Eritrean and some Ethiopians, 368 people died. 155 people were rescued, and among them about 40 unaccompanied minors, while 20 people were never found. As a direct consequence, in October 2013, the Italian government launched Operation Mare Nostrum, a military and humanitarian mission aiming at offering aid and avoiding further tragic events in the Mediterranean. Operation Mare Nostrum lasted a little over a year. In October 2014, it was replaced by Frontex Operation Triton. Frontex being the European Border and Coast Guard Agency. As the name suggests, its aim is to secure the external borders of the European Union. Why am I saying this? Because with the transition from Mare Nostrum, our sea, to Frontex, the Mediterranean was symbolically reconfigured from open common space to a border that needs to be controlled and defended. Because of the shift from Mare Nostrum to Frontex, the death toll in the Mediterranean Sea rose from 700 people in 2013 to 3,000, over 3,000 people in 2014. I have already referred to the peak of over 8,000 deaths and disappearances worldwide in 2016. Out of 8,000, more than 5,000 happened in the Mediterranean. The title of this webinar is Conflict and Human Displacement. And we could almost invert the terms and frame the issue in terms of human displacement and conflict. Because with the militarization of borders and the increasing criminalization of NGOs engaging in search and rescue activities, borders have become conflict zones, claiming a far too high number of lives. I have referred to the symbolic reconfiguration of the Mediterranean from Mare Nostrum, our sea, a common sea, to Frontex, frontier. So my question is, can faith-based communities and actors contribute to the work of symbolic reconfiguration of the Mediterranean and to the reconfiguration of borders from places of violent conflict to places of encounter and dialogue? In my research, I set theology in dialogue with the field of critical border studies. So I will now touch upon insights from critical border studies. Border scholars highlight how political transformations within the European Union, such as processes of expansion and integration, have had an impact on its borders. These have become softer inside the European Union and harder along its outer borders. Political transformations within the European Union and the related impact on its internal and external borders cast light on two major facts. The first one is the selective openness of borders, softer for some and harder for others. The second element is that borders are not fixed entities. A so-called processual turn has characterized border studies and critical border studies starting from the 1990s. Rather than fixed entities, borders are understood as processes. The function and meaning of borders is understood as constructed through practices and discourses. As borders are not just lines, but the results of processes, they are the outcome of what political sociologist Chris Rumford calls border work. Border work. Border scholars have shifted their focus from borders as lines to the activity of bordering. Rumford further points to the role of ordinary people in constructing, shifting, and dismantling borders. Bordering, debordering, which is deconstructive, and rebordering, reconstructing borders, are no longer the exclusive work of nation states or of the European Union, but are activities to which citizens as well as non-citizens contribute. Ordinary people contribute to border work by reinforcing borders, creating new ones, or working to erode them, for example, by mitigating the impact of borders. Further, writes Rumford, to the category of border work belong contributions to the symbolic nature of these borders. In other words, the category of border work includes the work of symbolic reconfigurations of borders. What is interesting for Rumford is that the group of people that engage in border work is increasingly large and diverse. And this very phenomenon compels to ask the question about what constitutes a border when the emphasis is rather on the processes of bordering than on the border as a thing. So to sum up to this point, as borders are understood as the result of historical and political processes, attention is drawn both to their materiality and to their cultural and symbolic meanings. A main interest of border studies is to see through which ideologies and practices symbolic meaning is attributed to borders. French philosopher Etienne Balibar has given a considerable contribution to the concept of borderlands. When a poor person from a poor country repeatedly tries to cross a border or is repeatedly pushed back, the border becomes a place where he or she resides. The border is not just a line, but a place or a land, a borderland. A very important contribution to the conceptualization of borderlands was offered by Chicana critical theorist Gloria Anzaldúa. Her book, Borderlands, La Frontera, published in 1987, is dedicated to people who inhabit borderlands similar to hers. Anzaldúa's starting point is a physical borderland, the Texas-US Southwest Mexican border. Yet the physical borderland overlaps with the psychological, the spiritual, and the cultural. Living in borderlands is living in between cultures while feeling part of none. The border as a line is meant to divide, to distinguish between us and them, to distinguish between places that are safe and unsafe. And yet, writes Anzaldúa, this line is ambiguous. It is vague, and the places it is meant to distinguish are blurred. Anzaldúa talks about the people who inhabit borderlands in between spaces as carrying a mixed consciousness, a mestiza consciousness. And then the work of this mixed consciousness is to break down dualisms, the subject-object duality that keeps people, border people, as prisoners. The work of this mixed consciousness is to transcend dualism. Anzaldúa writes that uprooting dualistic thinking in the individual and collective consciousness is the beginning of a long struggle, but a struggle that can bring us to the end of rape, of violence, and of war. And she's speaking about what is happening in the borderland between Mexico and Texas, but it makes me very much think about what happens, for example, in Libyan detention camps. The holistic way of thinking that Anzaldúa proposes has the potential to oppose violent dualistic thinking. One of the strongest and most poetic images that this author offers is that of the border as an open wound. The US-Mexican border, she writes, es una herida abierta, an open wound, where the third world grates against the first and bleeds. Yet Anzaldúa speaks of the herida abierta, the open wound, also as a healed injury, and of the skin as seamless, because to survive the borderland, border people have to live without borders. She writes, to survive the borderlands, you must live sin fronteras, as if the dividing line were not there. She writes, the sea cannot be fenced. El mar does not stop at borders. How relevant in relation to the Mediterranean. I have referred to how the borderland Anzaldúa writes about is also spiritual. The author advocates for a religion that can make sense of the borderland, a religion that is an expression of a border reality and that is able to amend the injury of the borderland. From the perspective of the borderland, the border does not just divide, but also connects. The borderland is the space where cultures may clash, but also overlap. And here, border people are mediators. I have mentioned that in critical border studies, the border is understood as the result of practices and discourses. I include in the category of practices the engagement of churches and faith-based organizations present on the physical border and engaged on issues of migration. And I include in the category of discourses theological reflection that accompanies such engagement. I have conducted theological empirical research on the engagement of the Italian Protestant churches on issues of migration present on the Mediterranean border, and have gathered information and reflected upon the concept of church on the border. How is a church on the border understood? And how does a church on the border reconfigure the border? Furthermore, what images of God accompany theological reflection on a church on the border? The majority of the people I have interviewed agree on the self-definition of being a church on the border. And the main understanding of this expression is being on the social and cultural margins of society, but also being present on physical borders, engaged on issues of migration. Definitions of a church on the border have consequences on understandings of what a border is. Several interviewees refer to the border as a convention. Historical events, which have resulted in shifting borders or shifting the political significance of borders, contribute to such perception of borders as conventions. Being a border church, interviewees say means questioning every border and reflecting on what life across borders entails. While several interviewees refer to borders as conventions and question their arbitrariness, their materiality is also recognized, particularly in relation to the impact that borders have on experiences of migration. The border, and I refer particularly to Sicily as borderland, is also described as a contact zone that allows for the offering and receiving of hospitality. The border is further described as an uncomfortable place, or a place of contradiction, social and political, but also of contradiction in terms of belief, in the sense that being on the border and being confronted by different life paths, including paths of faith, makes one question the content of one's faith. Borders are also perceived as places of conflict, and for this reason, a border church is a church engaged in issues of dialogue and reconciliation. A significant dimension of conflict is the lack of communication, and in this respect, a border church is a church that promotes dialogue and mutual understanding. As understandings of what a church on the border is and what a border is are intertwined, the understanding of one shapes the understanding of the other. The role of connector of a church on the border translates into an understanding of the border as a space of connection. The understanding of an open church translates into an understanding of the border as a mixed, hybrid space full of hermeneutical potential, rather than a line that separates two distinct, assumedly homogeneous contexts. A border church as an open church, a church without walls, is open not only to people coming from abroad, but is also open to the different components of one society. In more explicit theological terms, a border church perceives itself as prophetic, questioning expressions of Christianity that are not concerned with issues of justice, and offering a word of healing where anti-migration rhetoric is experienced as heartful. On the border, issues of humanity are at stake, and it's not only the value of the migrant person welcomed or rejected by the border. Being on the border is a test for the humanity of all people involved. A border church also adopts a border hermeneutics, which means a perspective on reality starting from the border. And this border hermeneutics can assume theological connotations in the sense of, and now I'm using a very theological term, understanding the border as locus theologicus. The border is finally understood as the privileged space of observation on the phenomenon of migration, and accordingly as a particularly suitable space from which a border church can conduct work on migration issues. Understandings of God or images of God are reformulated in relation to understandings of a church on the border and of the border itself. The image of a God who welcomes everyone without distinctions merges with the image of a community that welcomes, of a hospitable community. Confessing one's faith in a God who is open to diversity means expressing allegiance to an inclusive faith community equally open to diversity. God is further thought of as a borderless God, God beyond borders. When God is encountered through people, meeting a great variety of people translates into images of a wide God, a God who is beyond borders, borders understood as both material and theological. The reality of borders or boundaries that separate and kill is contraposed to the image of a borderless God. In this sense, the reality of borders calls for an understanding of God that counters their constraining and deadly function. Images of God and border policies are in a circular relationship. Talking about the boundless love of God calls to reflect on issues of borders, exclusion, and inclusion. It calls theology to contribute to the work of symbolic reconfiguration of borders, opposed to their ordering and excluding function. Setting theology in dialogue with critical border studies finally is a claim for the relevance of theology to contribute to just migration policies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniela. That was very interesting perspectives from borders as conflict zones to borders as locus theologicus, and you gave some very interesting perspectives on the way. So we did start this webinar a little bit late due to some technical issues. We will still remain with the time frame, which leaves us now 13 minutes to first. I mean, it would be great to hear your comments to each other, but since we have a little limited time, I would like to also open the floor for the listeners. And just so you know, we need you, if you have a comment or question, please use the raise hand function. And I will call your name, and you will have sound, not video, just so you are prepared that we will not see you. And again, this is recorded, so I will open the floor for questions from whoever is out there. There is a hand from Trygve Willer. I will give you the word then first.
Thank you, Kaya. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I just want to, first of all, thank all the three speakers for very good and informative and interventions which make us think. So thanks a lot. I have one question specifically to Daniela, who was the last speaker. In 2016, I visited also Lampedusa, the Sicilian island, very close to Libya. And that was 1 or 2 years after this terrible shipwreck in 2014. And on the top, Lampedusa is a small island, but it's like 100 meters above the sea level. On the top there is a kind of grass top. And on the top there, very, very small and almost impossible to see it. There is a kind of symbolization of the shipwrecks and all the dead people from 2014. Small symbols in the nature, small grass things and small stones. It's almost impossible to see them if no one tells you. But that was the symbol which made a great impression. The question to Daniela is, do you think this is a church topic, or is it something beyond church? I ask because I think that the symbols of the shipwreck was done by local inhabitants and not by any specific church-related community. So the border also consists of the local people And my question is if you could reflect on the church relationship to these local people acting on behalf or in favor of the migrants, because that would, in my view, also expand the topic of church even more in the very good manner that you started. Thank you.
Yes, I will try to be brief because I want to leave space for other people to comment. I would say, Italy is a very Catholic country, is a very religious country. And I think that when people are confronted with death in these proportions, and Lampedusa becoming a symbol of the refugee crisis or so-called refugee crisis and of all the deaths happening, and I refer to the 75% of all border-related deaths happening in the Mediterranean. I think this affects the local population as well. And then the Pope Francis has been given quite a lot of visibility to Lampedusa exactly after these shipwrecks. So I think that there has been quite a lot of mobilization by religious communities, by religious authorities, and what is happening is mobilizing the religious sensitivity of people. I was in Lampedusa a couple of years ago, and I received as a gift a cross, a wooden cross made out of wood from boats that had been involved in a shipwreck. So I would say, Mankell, the Swedish writer, speaks about Lampedusa as the center of Europe, because at Lampedusa we will decide the identity of Europe in the future. I think that the religion is an important resource to mobilize in terms of deciding what kind of identity Europe will have in the future, and using Lampedusa as a hermeneutical starting point for that kind of process.
Okay, thank you very much. So at the moment there aren't a lot of raised hands, so I think I would like to invite Filippo and Hans Morten, if you can, in 1 minute, possibly 1.5, if you can just give us some impressions after now these other two colleagues have also been able to participate. So Filippo, I'll give you the word first.
Thank you, Kaya. Well, it'll be very easy because thanks for your presentation. There are two things that got my attention because we are so also focused on that in our work here at the center, looking at migration in Africa, that is related to migration due to conflicts, but it's broader. So what Hans was saying about the narrative of migration, how important is the perception of migration, how migrants, how human mobility is portrayed, how is the narrative at the very basic level of conversation in a family, in a community, and how these is shaping the way migration is accepted or is seen as an obstacle, is approached as a resource, or seen as a threat. And I mean, this is so important for us. We have a full dedicated area of our website about that because it's such an important topic. While I wanted to stress one thing about also, obviously, what Daniela was saying about the borders, we have recently completed an interesting research about vulnerable minors cross-boarding, Zambia, Malawi, Zimbabwe, and this is not related directly to conflict, but it's exactly what you were saying. And we gave the title to that report of border as place of invisibility, because migrants, when they cross borders and they, as you say, they are there in a kind of limbo where you don't feel you're not anymore in your country of origin, you don't belong to the new culture, to the new place. one of the dynamic is this: you prefer to be invisible because you feel safer. And it's a very interesting thing because it affects them, but I mean, for example, we were interacting with many NGO working on the field to support them, but they couldn't support them because they prefer to stay behind the scenes because of the obviously of the all the consequences of being a migrant in a as a foreigner in another country. Now, just to add these, but I think that all we have spoken is really relevant, and the topic is very interesting for civil society, for governments, and for the church.
Thank you very much, Filippo. It looks like now then, Hans Morten, that you have the privilege of getting the last word in about 2 minutes, and then I will close. Of course, this conversation is absolutely in no way over, but we have to follow the rules. So, Hans Morten.
Thank you. My role working here for now 18 years has been to try to kind of be a bridge builder between my backgrounds, being a political scientist, also with a PhD in law, both ways. The role of the churches and diaconal actors can have quite something to say about political decision making and legal decision making, so to say. And also how kind of insight from political science and law are relevant for churches and diaconal actors. But I just want to say that the presentation by Daniela kind of really shows the strength of a theological approach by kind of emphasizing the humane dimensions of theology. So that was a very rich presentation, which more persons should have heard, I can say. So kind of my kind of figure-based analysis from political science kind of comes some way in explaining, but it doesn't come the whole way of motivating, I can say. But my translation / bridge building work both ways will continue, because I do think that the voice of the churches and of diaconal actors has something to say about political decision making and legal decision making. And I do think that the insights from the two disciplines have something to say for the church and how the church can be an actor as a kind of pioneer and also as a defender of the rights and interests of vulnerable persons, broadly speaking. So I think this was a very rich conversation. And to you, Filippo, I think that of course, you could have also been given more figures. I was only pointing to some of the macro figures from how the Christian Council, Multicultural Christian Network, was communicating. But we all know the macro figures, when they're broken down, they kind of really show that the majority of the persons who are on the move are relocating within the countries, like the IDPs, internally displaced persons, and how the burdens on a global scale are really that unjust, to use that term, that the people from the north might not acknowledge fully that it is the countries in the south who are really bearing the large share of the burdens for hosting and sustaining lives of those displaced. In 1998, the World Council of Churches had a program, Risking to Be with Uprooted People, and I was trying to kind of make that program visible in Norway. And that challenge has not been less, 26 years that has passed since 1998. So I think that both of your presentations were very rich, so thank you.
Thank you very much. And with that, we close. I would like you all to know that the next webinar is on March 21st, same time, same place. The title is to be announced. We have realized that the world is simply moving too fast. There are too many things going on to commit to a title 6 months ahead. So that will be announced, and I hope to see all of you there, and I hope that we can continue these conversations on different platforms in the future. So thank you very much. See you all next time.